Welcome to Upri Audiobooks. Tonight, I invite you to take a journey unlike any you've taken before. This is not simply a story about heaven and hell. It is a story about the silent battles we fight when life seems to fall apart. It is about the nights when sleep refuses to come, when the bills continue to grow, when every door seems to close, when your prayers seem to disappear into silence, and when you begin to wonder if God still hears your voice. If you've ever stood at that crossroads, if you've ever questioned your purpose, if you've ever asked, how much longer can I keep going? Then this journey is for you. Meet Jerome, a hard-working husband who has given everything he has for those he loves. A man who has tasted disappointment, failure, fear, and despair. A man who discovers that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with fists, they are fought with faith. Inspired by the grand tradition of allegorical journeys through darkness, yet told as an original story rooted in hope, perseverance, and redemption. Can someone keep faith when God seems silent? Follows one man's extraordinary path through impossible trials toward a truth that will change him forever. Remember one simple truth as the journey begins. To get out, you must go through. Before we begin, if you enjoy immersive audiobooks, inspiring stories, and cinematic adventures that stay with you long after the final chapter, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Upri Audiobooks, and turn on notifications. Every like, every subscription, and every comment helps us continue creating stories like this and share them with more listeners around the world. Now, find a comfortable place, take a deep breath, let the world around you grow quiet, dim the lights if you can, put on your headphones, and step with Jerome into a journey where every trial has a purpose, every choice carries eternal weight, and every step through the darkness brings him closer to the light. This is Can Someone Keep Faith When God Seems Silent? Chapter 1 begins now. Chapter 1, $5. There are nights when silence is louder than thunder. Jerome had learned that long ago. At 55 years old, sleep had become something he remembered more than something he enjoyed. The ceiling above his bed had become as familiar as an old friend, its cracks forming maps he had traced with weary eyes through countless sleepless nights. Beside him, his wife slept lightly, one hand still reaching across the mattress, as though even in her dreams she refused to let him carry life alone. He smiled. It was a small smile, the kind born from gratitude mixed with guilt. She deserved more than this. More than overdue bills stacked on the kitchen table. More than apology after apology. More than another promise that next month would be different. Jerome quietly slipped from the bed before dawn, careful not to wake her. He knelt beside the mattress, elbows resting on tired knees. No grand speech escaped his lips, only a whisper. "Father, I don't know what to ask you anymore." The room remained still. "I've prayed for work." Silence. "I've prayed for wisdom." Nothing. "I've prayed for strength." Only the slow hum of an old ceiling fan answered him. He lowered his head. "But I'm still here." He stood, dressed for another day of temporary labor, and left before the sun could climb above the rooftops. The job paid almost nothing. By the time taxes were taken, fuel was purchased, and the day finally ended. Jerome looked at the folded bills in his hand. It wasn't enough. It never seemed to be enough. He drove home slowly, stopping only long enough to transfer nearly everything into the joint account he shared with his wife. Mortgage, electricity, insurance, groceries. One payment after another. When the screen finally settled, $25 remained to his name. He stared at the number for a long time. $15 would buy enough gas to get him back to work tomorrow. That left 10. He pulled into a small neighborhood pizza shop. The smell almost made him forget how tired he was. He ordered one slice, one fountain drink. The cashier smiled. "That'll be $5. Jerome nodded, reaching into his pocket. $5. Half of everything he had left in the world. He carried the paper plate toward a table near the window. Before he sat down, movement outside caught his attention. A woman. Her clothes hung loosely from her shoulders. 3 children clung to her. The youngest couldn't have been older than 4. The little boy looked through the restaurant window, not at the people, but at the food. Jerome stopped walking. Something inside him tightened. He knew that feeling. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't pity. It was that quiet tug he had felt his entire life. The one that always seemed to cost him something. He closed his eyes. Lord! No answer came. He laughed softly to himself. You always let me decide this part. He picked up the slice, carried it outside, knelt beside the youngest child, and handed the meal to him. The boy's eyes widened. The mother covered her mouth, unable to speak. Jerome placed the drink beside the slice. It's all right, he said gently. Take it. The woman whispered, God bless you. Jerome smiled. I hope he does. He turned and walked back toward his car, his stomach empty but strangely peaceful. Then he heard laughter. A polished luxury SUV rolled to the curb. The woman gathered the children. They climbed inside. The vehicle pulled away. Jerome stood frozen. His empty hand slowly curled into a fist. He looked down at the $5 still folded in his wallet. His jaw tightened. A bitter thought rose before he could stop it. What kind of fool am I? Another thought followed even faster. Maybe being good doesn't matter. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned pale. For once, he whispered into the empty car. Why can't I win? His voice cracked. I work. I pray. I give. I keep getting back up. So why does it always feel like I'm climbing a mountain that's falling apart beneath my feet? He leaned his forehead against the steering wheel. I didn't ask to be born. The words hung in the silence. Heavy, dangerous. For a long moment, Jerome did not move. Then quietly, I shouldn't have said that. He started the engine and drove home, carrying $5 in his pocket, and a burden far heavier than money. Chapter 2. The Earth Gives Way. Morning arrived, but it brought Jerome no rest. He had barely slept. The words he had spoken in the car haunted him long before the alarm sounded. I didn't ask to be born. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his tired eyes. His wife stirred beside him. You all right? She asked softly. Jerome forced a smile. I've been better. She reached for his hand. We'll get through this. Those words should have comforted him. Instead, they hurt. Because she still believed. She still believed in him. She still believed in God. He wasn't sure he had enough strength to believe in either. By 8 o'clock, his phone rang. It was an old friend. Jerome, you still looking for work? Every day. I've got a framing crew building a house outside town. One of my guys called out. It'll be good money. Good money. Jerome closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he smiled. I'll be there. The drive felt different. The sun seemed brighter. For once, he allowed himself to dream. If the pay was what his friend hinted, they could catch up on the electric bill. Buy groceries without counting every dollar. Maybe even take his wife out to dinner. Nothing fancy. Just somewhere they didn't have to share a meal. He laughed to himself. Maybe this is it, Lord. The words felt hopeful, almost foreign. The construction site stood on a hill overlooking the valley. Fresh lumber, concrete trucks. The smell of cut pine filled the morning air. Jerome climbed out of his truck and shook hands with the foreman. You Jerome? That's me. The man looked down at his clipboard. The other guy already came back. Jerome's smile faded. But we can still use another hand. Relief washed over him. Great. The foreman continued. Pays $20 an hour. Jerome blinked. His friend had told him nearly twice that amount. The excitement drained from his face. Still, 20 was better than nothing. He nodded. I'll take it. For 6 hours he carried lumber, hung rafters, sweated beneath the summer heat. Every muscle screamed. His knees ached, his back burned. At lunch he sat alone on a stack of plywood overlooking the valley below. He opened the small lunch his wife had packed. 2 slices of bread, a little meat, an apple. He stared at it for a long time, then looked toward the unfinished house. He quietly calculated. Gas, taxes, food, where on the truck. By the time he finished adding everything together, there would barely be anything left. He laughed, not because it was funny, because he no longer knew what else to do. He looked toward heaven, cloudless, silent. So this is the breakthrough? Nothing. He lowered his head. You know, his voice trembled. I've defended you. I've told people to trust you. I've said you always make a way. His hand slowly tightened. But I'm tired. Very tired. The words spilled out before he could stop them. If my soul was worth anything, he stared into the distance, I'd probably sell it. The sentence echoed in the stillness. Unlike yesterday, he didn't take it back. He meant it, not because he hated God, because he had stopped believing life could ever change. Across the yard, someone laughed. Another worker called out to his friend, Your time's coming, brother. Just be patient. Jerome rolled his eyes. Easy to say, he muttered. Then, everything stopped. Birds exploded from the trees. The ground vibrated beneath his boots. A low rumble rolled beneath the earth. At first it sounded like distant thunder. Then it grew louder. Violent. The plywood beneath Jerome shifted. Tools slid across the floor. Someone shouted, Earthquake! The world lurched. Walls twisted. Beams snapped like dry branches. The unfinished house groaned as if it were alive. Jerome leaped to his feet. Workers ran in every direction. Concrete cracked. Glass shattered. The hillside split open with a deafening roar. The earth itself screamed. A massive section of ground collapsed beneath the house. The structure folded inward. Dust swallowed everything. Jerome tried to run. The floor disappeared beneath him. He plunged into darkness. Timber crashed around him. Nails, stone, concrete. The sound of breaking earth became unbearable. He clawed upward through choking dust. Above him, a narrow shaft of daylight. He reached for it. Something moved below. Not falling. Climbing. Fast. Far too fast. He couldn't see it, but he felt it. The sensation froze his blood. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a man. It felt hungry. Jerome pulled himself higher. His fingers slipped against broken stone. The thing below climbed faster. Closer. Closer. One final desperate pull. His hand caught the edge. He threw himself forward into the light. He rolled across solid ground, gasping for breath. Silence. No sirens, no workers, no wind, only silence. Then the smell reached him. Rotten eggs, sulfur, burning metal. Decay so deep it seemed to crawl inside his lungs. Jerome slowly stood. The sky was gone. The sun was gone. The world itself had vanished. Only an endless crimson horizon remained. Somewhere in the distance, something screamed. It did not sound human. Behind him, a calm voice broke the silence. You climbed faster than most. Jerome turned. An older man stood several yards away. Dust covered his boots. His clothes were plain. His face carried neither fear nor surprise, only quiet compassion. Jerome stared. I know you. The stranger smiled gently. We've met. Jerome searched his memory. The street, the man who had fallen, the one everyone walked past. The stranger nodded as though reading the thought before Jerome spoke it. Yes. Jerome looked around in horror. Where are we? The man's eyes lifted toward the dark horizon. Then he answered with quiet certainty. You are alive. Jerome frowned. But no living man was ever meant to come here. A long silence passed. Finally, Jerome whispered, Am I in hell? The stranger looked into the darkness ahead. To leave. He paused. Not you must go through. Chapter 3. The First Law. The stranger did not wait for Jerome to answer. He simply turned and began walking. The ground beneath their feet was unlike earth. It breathed, not with life, but with memory. Each step sent a faint ripple through the black stone, as though the land itself remembered every foot that had crossed it. Jerome hurried after him. Wait! The man stopped but did not turn. You said I'm alive. I did. You said no living man was meant to come here. I did. Then tell me where I am. The stranger slowly faced him. What you are about to witness is not the fullness of judgment, nor the whole of eternity. Jerome listened carefully. You have been permitted to walk through shadows that reveal truth. The man's voice remained calm. Learn from them. He paused, but do not mistake them for all that is. Jerome frowned. I don't understand. You will. The stranger continued walking. Every traveler says the same thing. They came to the edge of a cliff. Jerome froze. Beyond it stretched a valley so vast that the horizon disappeared into darkness. Rivers glowed like molten iron. Forests twisted upward, like hands reaching from forgotten graves. Mountains rose in impossible shapes, their peaks disappearing into clouds that flashed with silent crimson lightning. Somewhere far below, a bell rang, one deep note, then another, not calling people together. Counting, Jerome swallowed. What is this place? The guide answered without looking away. A place where every soul is confronted by truth. Jerome felt a chill despite the heat. Is this hell? The stranger was silent for a long moment. Names matter less than purpose. As they descended a narrow stone path, Jerome noticed something strange. There were no chains, no demons dragging people through the dust, no screams from every direction. Instead, there were choices. At every fork in the road stood travelers. Some stepped toward the light. Others walked willingly into deeper darkness. No one's forcing them, Jerome whispered. The guide nodded. Many prisons have no walls. A cry echoed through the valley. Jerome turned. A man ran across the plain, clutching a heavy chest overflowing with gold. Behind him came shadows, not chasing the treasure, chasing him. The man stumbled. Instead of dropping the chest, he held it tighter. The shadows caught him. In an instant, both vanished into the darkness. Jerome stood speechless. He could have let it go. Yes. Why didn't he? The guide looked at Jerome. Some burdens become so familiar. People mistake them for part of themselves. They continued walking. The air grew hotter. The smell of sulfur lingered beneath every breath. Yet every so often, a cool breeze passed over them. It carried the scent of rain, fresh grass, olive trees. Home. Jerome closed his eyes. What was that? The guide smiled faintly. A reminder. Of what? That no darkness exists beyond the reach of the light. Hours, or perhaps only moments, passed. Time no longer behaved as Jerome expected. Then he saw someone. An old traveler sat beside the road beneath a solitary tree, whose leaves shimmered with silver light. Unlike everything else in the valley, the tree was alive. Its roots reached into both shadow and radiance. The traveler wore simple robes. His face bore the marks of long years, but his eyes held a peace Jerome had never seen. As Jerome approached, the old man looked up and smiled. I once ran from the very voice that loved me. Jerome stopped. I believed distance could silence my calling. The old man rested a weathered hand against the trunk. But mercy found me where the sea could not hide me. He looked directly at Jerome. Do not confuse delay with abandonment. Jerome felt tears forming. I've prayed. The old man nodded. I know. I don't hear anything. You are listening for thunder. The traveler smiled gently. When very often, God speaks like rain. A warm light surrounded the old man, not blinding, gentle, peaceful. The silver leaves began to glow. The guide bowed his head in quiet respect. Jerome opened his mouth to ask another question, but the traveler simply smiled. The light grew brighter. Then, like the last rays of evening slipping beyond the horizon, he was gone. Only the living tree remained. Jerome stood in silence. Finally, he whispered, Who was he? The guide resumed walking. A servant. Nothing more, nothing less. Jerome looked once more at the empty place beneath the tree. Then he followed. Far ahead, carved into black stone, stood an enormous gate. Across its arch were words that made his heart sink. The first trial awaits. Chapter 4. The Trial of Empty Hands. The gate did not open. It listened. Jerome felt it before he understood it. The stone beneath his feet pulsed once, then again. The archway towered nearly 100 feet overhead, carved from black rock that seemed older than mountains. Veins of dim crimson light moved through it like blood through ancient flesh. No hinges, no chains, no guards. Only silence. Jerome looked toward the guide. "Aren't we going in?" The guide answered without taking his eyes from the gate. "It is deciding." "Deciding what?" "If you are carrying something that cannot enter." Jerome instinctively checked his pockets, his wallet, his truck keys, a worn photograph of his wife folded neatly inside his shirt. "That's not what it means," the guide said. Before Jerome could answer, the gate spoke, not with a voice, with memory. Suddenly, he was standing in his own living room. Past due notices covered the table. His wife smiled anyway. "We'll make it." He remembered nodding while secretly wondering if he believed those words. The vision changed. He saw himself sitting alone in his truck after giving away the pizza. His hands gripped the steering wheel. "Why can't I win?" Then another memory, the construction site. "I'd sell my soul if it was worth anything." Each sentence echoed louder than before. Jerome covered his ears. "Stop!" The gate did not stop. It showed him every bitter thought he wished he had never spoken, every jealous glance, every moment he questioned God's goodness, every prayer he abandoned halfway through because he believed no one was listening. When the memories finally ended, Jerome dropped to one knee. "I know," he whispered. "I know what I said." The guide stepped beside him. "The gate has no interest in your words." Jerome looked up. "It listens for what your heart still refuses to release." The great doors trembled. A narrow opening appeared, just wide enough for one man. Jerome stood. "I can go?" The guide shook his head. "You can try." Jerome stepped forward. The instant he reached the opening, an invisible force threw him backward. He crashed onto the stone. "What happened?" "You are still holding something." "I don't have anything." The guide's eyes were filled with compassion. "You are carrying resentment." Jerome opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, because he knew. Not resentment toward people, resentment toward life, toward disappointment, toward prayers that seemed unanswered, toward the endless struggle of trying to do right while watching others prosper through deceit. He lowered his head. "I don't know how to let it go." The guide knelt beside him. "For years you have asked God to remove your burdens." Jerome nodded. "What if he brought you here? To teach you how to lay them down?" Tears filled Jerome's eyes. "I don't know if I can." The guide smiled gently. "You cannot." A long silence followed. "But he can." Jerome slowly closed his eyes. For the first time in many months, his prayer contained no requests, no bargaining, no promises, only surrender. "Father," his voice trembled. "I'm tired. So tired. I don't even know how to trust you anymore." A tear struck the stone. "But if there's anything left in me, please carry what I can't." The valley became still. A warm breeze passed through the gate. Jerome felt no lightning, no miracle, no great surge of strength, only something strangely familiar. The burden wasn't gone, but it was no longer crushing him. The guide stood. "Try again." Jerome walked toward the opening. This time, nothing stopped him. He crossed the threshold. Behind him, the gate closed without a sound. The guide joined him on the other side. He looked at Jerome with quiet approval. "You have learned the first law." Jerome wiped his eyes. "What law?" The guide's expression softened. "To get out." He let the words settle into Jerome's heart. "Now you must go through." Ahead, the path divided into 3 roads. One glowed with wealth, one with comfort. One disappeared into shadow beneath a weathered sign carved into ancient stone. The guide pointed toward the darkest path. Jerome sighed. "I was afraid you'd choose that one." The guide smiled. "I didn't." Jerome frowned. "Then who did?" The guide looked upward. "The one who intends to bring you home." Chapter 5. The road that few choose. The dark road was unlike the others. It made no promise. To Jerome's left, a broad stone highway shimmered beneath a golden sky. Travelers laughed as they hurried toward distant towers glittering with wealth. Their burdens seemed light. their pace quick. To his right stretched another road lined with quiet gardens. Gentle music drifted through the air. Soft beds rested beneath flowering trees. No one appeared hurried. No one appeared troubled. Straight ahead, the third path disappeared into a valley swallowed by mist. No music, no laughter, only silence. Jerome looked at the guide. "I've spent my whole life taking the hard road." The guide nodded. "And what has it taught you?" Jerome thought for a moment. "That doing what's right doesn't always make life easier." "No, it rarely does." The guide stepped onto the shadowed path. "But it often makes your soul stronger." Jerome followed. Within minutes, the light behind them vanished. The air grew cold. Not the cold of winter, the cold of loneliness, the kind that settles into a man's chest after years of disappointment. Jerome wrapped his arms around himself. "This place," the guide answered before he finished, "feeds upon isolation." They continued until shapes emerged through the fog. People, hundreds of them, each walked alone. Though only a few feet apart, they never looked at one another. Some wept. Some argued with invisible voices. Some laughed without joy. Some whispered prayers that never seemed to end. "Why don't they speak to each other?" Jerome asked. "They believed no one could understand their pain." Jerome watched an elderly woman pass only inches from a young man. Neither acknowledged the other. "It's as if they're invisible. They have convinced themselves they are." The guide stopped. "Listen." Jerome strained his ears. At first he heard nothing. Then, words. Thousands of whispers, not spoken by mouths, spoken inside hearts. "You're a failure. You'll never recover. God has forgotten you. No one needs you. You're too late. You're not enough." Jerome's breathing quickened. "I've heard those." "I know." The guide looked at him. "So has nearly every traveler who has walked this road." A sudden cry pierced the mist. Jerome turned. A man had fallen beneath the weight of an enormous chain wrapped around his shoulders. The chain bore no iron links. Every link was a word: shame, failure, fear, rejected, worthless. The man clawed at them desperately. "They won't come off!" he screamed. "They won't come off!" Jerome instinctively stepped toward him. The guide placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Careful." "Why?" "You cannot carry another man's chains." Jerome looked into the stranger's terrified eyes. "Then how do I help him?" The guide replied quietly, "Remind him where the key is." Jerome knelt beside the broken man. "I don't know your story." The man sobbed. "I've ruined everything. I've heard that feeling." The stranger looked up. "You have?" Jerome nodded slowly. "More times than I'd like to admit." The man lowered his head. "I don't know if God would still want me." Jerome felt something stir deep within him. Not an answer he had prepared, one he had lived. "I don't think he ever stopped." The chains trembled. One link cracked, then another. The stranger stared in disbelief. The guide smiled, saying nothing. The man stood. The weight had not completely disappeared, but he could walk again. He whispered, "Thank you." Jerome shook his head. "Don't thank me. Keep walking." The stranger disappeared into the mist. Jerome turned to the guide. "I didn't do anything." The guide's eyes reflected quiet joy. "You gave hope. Hope is never small." They continued until the fog slowly began to thin. Far ahead stood a solitary lantern burning with a clear white flame. Unlike every other light Jerome had seen, this one gave warmth without heat. As they approached, he noticed someone standing beside it. The figure wore a simple cloak. Their face was hidden beneath its hood, yet a gentle radiance surrounded them, causing the darkness itself to retreat. The figure spoke only one sentence. "When you believe heaven has become silent," the voice was calm, "look for the light carried by those who still choose to love." Jerome opened his mouth to ask who the traveler was, but the lantern flared brilliantly. The hooded figure faded into the radiance. Only the lantern remained. The guide lifted it from its stand and handed it to Jerome. "For me?" "For the next trial." Jerome held the lantern carefully. Its light did not illuminate the road ahead. Instead, it illuminated him. The guide smiled. Only the light within you can reveal the path before you. They walked on into the deepening darkness, where something vast shifted beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. For the first time since entering this strange realm, Jerome understood that not every shadow was meant to frighten him. Some existed only so the light could be seen. Chapter 6. The Mirror of Ashes. They walked until the lantern's white flame became the only light remaining. The darkness no longer pressed against Jerome. It watched. That unsettled him even more. "Does this place know we're here?" he asked. The guide nodded. "It knows you." Jerome tightened his grip on the lantern. "It knows every traveler." The path narrowed until it entered a canyon of black stone. The walls rose hundreds of feet into the darkness, their surfaces smooth as polished glass. At first, Jerome thought they reflected the lantern. Then he realized. They reflected him, only not as he was. The first reflection showed a younger Jerome, strong, laughing, holding the keys to the business he had built with years of sacrifice. He remembered that day, the ribbon cutting, the excitement, the prayers of thanksgiving, his wife hugging him with tears in her eyes. "It wasn't supposed to end," Jerome whispered. The image changed. The business stood empty. Boxes filled the floor, the bank notices and the creditors, the phone calls he stopped answering. The reflection looked at him with hollow eyes. "You failed." Jerome stopped walking. "I know." The reflection smiled. "No, you became failure." The words struck harder than any blow. Jerome lowered his head. "I lost a business." The reflection stepped closer from within the stone. "No, you lost yourself." The canyon echoed with cruel laughter. Not from demons, from every reflection, thousands of Jeromes, every age, every regret, every mistake, every version of the man he wished he had been. "You weren't smart enough. You weren't strong enough. You weren't faithful enough. You should have quit years ago. You disappointed everyone." The voices became deafening. Jerome dropped to his knees. "Stop!" They only grew louder. "You call yourself a husband? You call yourself a provider? You call yourself a man?" The lantern flickered. For the first time, its light weakened. Jerome buried his face in his hands. "I know. I know all of it." The guide remained still. He did not silence the voices. He did not shield Jerome from them. Instead, he asked one quiet question. "Who taught you to speak to yourself this way?" Jerome looked up. "What? These voices. They sound familiar." Jerome listened, slowly. His shoulders slumped. "They're mine." The guide nodded. "No enemy has wounded you more deeply than the man whose voice you hear every morning." Jerome stared at his own reflection. It was true. No creditor, no employer, no stranger, no critic had ever spoken to him as harshly as he had spoken to himself. The guide stepped beside one of the mirrors. "Look carefully." Jerome did. For the first time, he noticed something. The reflections never showed the whole story. Only the failures. Never the nights he stayed awake praying for his family. Never the meals he skipped so someone else could eat. Never the stranger he had helped. Never the $5 he had given away. Never his wife's quiet smile. Never the countless times he had chosen integrity when dishonesty would have been easier. "They're lying," Jerome whispered. The guide shook his head. "Not entirely." Jerome frowned. "They show your failures. But they hide God's faithfulness." The lantern suddenly burned brighter. One mirror cracked. Then another. Then another. The sound echoed through the canyon like distant thunder. The reflections screamed as fractures spread across every wall. Within moments, the mirrors collapsed into piles of gray ash. Silence returned. Jerome looked at the ashes covering the path. "What was this place?" The guide answered gently. "The Valley of Accusation. They were trying to make me hate myself." "No." The guide looked directly into Jerome's eyes. "They were trying to make you believe your worst day is your identity." Jerome stood quietly. He brushed the ash from his boots. It isn't. No, it never was. The canyon opened into a vast plain. Far in the distance, beyond rolling hills of black stone, Jerome saw something that made him stop. A city. Its towers stretched into the crimson sky. Some shone with breathtaking beauty. Others burned. Some were already collapsing. Others looked untouched by time. "What's that?" Jerome asked. The guide's expression became solemn. "The city of choices." "Do we go there?" "Everyone does." Jerome looked toward the impossible skyline. "It looks beautiful." The guide's eyes never left the city. "It can be." He paused. "Or it can become the most dangerous place you will ever walk." Together they continued toward the distant gates as the white lantern cast its quiet light across the road, revealing one truth that Jerome could no longer deny. His greatest prison had never been poverty. It had been believing that God could forgive everyone except him. Chapter 7. The City of Choices. The city stood in absolute silence, not because it was empty, because everyone inside was listening. Jerome slowed his steps as the towering gates came into view. They were fashioned from a metal unlike anything he had ever seen. It reflected neither the crimson sky nor the lantern's white flame. Instead, it reflected the deepest desire of the one looking upon it. Jerome saw a modest home, a paid-off mortgage, a kitchen where laughter replaced worry, his wife smiling without hiding her fears, a table covered with food, no overdue notices, no collection calls, no shame. His eyes filled with tears. The guide watched quietly. "What do you see?" Jerome swallowed. "Everything I've prayed for." The guide nodded. "And that is why this city is dangerous." The gates opened without a sound. Inside, the streets were beautiful, too beautiful. Marble avenues stretched in every direction. Crystal fountains flowed with water so clear they reflected stars that did not exist in the sky above. Trees heavy with fruit lined the roads, untouched by decay. People walked with purpose. Some smiled, some hurried, some stood perfectly still. None acknowledged Jerome. "Where are they going?" he asked. "Toward whatever they love most." As they continued, Jerome noticed something unsettling. No two streets were the same. One shimmered with wealth beyond imagination. Another promised honor and influence. Another echoed with applause. Another displayed families reunited. Another offered perfect health. Another whispered of youth restored. Every street appeared good. Every destination seemed worthy. Jerome frowned. "I don't understand." "You will." The guide stopped before a small stone marker. Carved into it were simple words. "Every choice gives something. Every choice takes something." Jerome read them twice. "What does that mean?" Before the guide could answer, a well-dressed man approached. His clothes were immaculate, his smile warm, his voice inviting. "You look tired." Jerome nodded cautiously. "I am. You've carried enough." The stranger gestured toward a magnificent house overlooking the city. "I have work for a man like you?" Jerome glanced at the guide. The guide said nothing. "What kind of work?" Jerome asked. "Simple." The man smiled wider. "No more worrying about bills. No more counting dollars. No more wondering whether your wife will have enough." Jerome felt his heart race. "What's the catch?" The man laughed. "Everyone always asks that." He stepped closer. "Nothing dishonest. Nothing violent. Nothing illegal. Just—" His smile slowly hardened. "Stop trusting the one who keeps disappointing you." The city became unnaturally still. Jerome stared. "You don't have to curse him. You don't even have to deny him. Just stop expecting anything from him." The words struck Jerome harder than any accusation, because they sounded reasonable. The stranger continued. "Believe in yourself. Depend on yourself. Take what you can. Keep what you earn. No more giving away your last $5. Jerome looked down. The stranger wasn't offering evil. He was offering independence, a life where Jerome never needed faith again. The guide finally spoke. "What is the first lie every heart wants to believe?" Jerome answered almost without thinking, "That I don't need God." The stranger's smile faded. He took one step backward. The white lantern in Jerome's hand burned brighter. The stranger's fine clothes dissolved into drifting ash. Within moments, nothing remained. Jerome looked around. No one else seemed surprised. "They never force anyone," the guide said. "They simply wait until someone is tired enough to agree." They walked deeper into the city. Soon they reached a small courtyard. At its center sat an elderly traveler dressed in plain garments. A quiet radiance surrounded him. He was repairing a cracked clay jar, patiently, carefully, as though every broken piece still mattered. Jerome approached. "Why fix something that's already broken?" The old traveler smiled without looking up. "Because broken is not the same as worthless." He gently fitted another piece into place. "The maker has never thrown away what he intends to restore." Jerome watched in silence. "I've felt broken for a long time." The traveler nodded. "So did I." He placed the final piece into the jar. "It was only after I broke that I finally allowed the potter to shape me." The jar, once cracked from top to bottom, now held together beautifully. The fractures remained visible, yet somehow they made it more beautiful than before. The old traveler stood, his face glowed with quiet peace. He looked at Jerome. "Do not ask heaven why you were broken." He smiled. "Ask what the master intends to build with the pieces." The radiance surrounding him slowly brightened. Like the first light of dawn, he was gone. Only the restored jar remained. Jerome reached out and touched it. The cracks were real, but so was its strength. The guide resumed walking. "You've completed another lesson." Jerome looked back one last time. "I still don't know who he was." The guide smiled. "You weren't meant to." As they left the courtyard, the streets behind them slowly disappeared into mist. Ahead, beyond the city's final gate, the ground descended toward a valley where no light reached. From somewhere below came the sound of countless voices, not screaming, weeping. The guide stopped at the edge of the descent. His expression grew solemn. "Beyond this point," he looked directly at Jerome, "compassion will cost you more than comfort." Jerome tightened his grip on the lantern. "I'll keep walking." The guide nodded. "I know." Together they stepped into the darkness, where the next trial waited, not to test Jerome's strength, but the depth of his mercy. Chapter 8. The Valley of Forgotten Tears. The path descended slowly. With every step, the warmth of the lantern seemed to matter more. The darkness here was different. It did not threaten. It mourned. Jerome heard it long before he saw anyone. Soft weeping. Not one voice. Thousands. The sound rose and fell like waves upon a black sea, carrying sorrow so deep that it settled into his chest. He stopped walking. "I've never heard crying like this." The guide answered quietly. "These are not cries of rage. They are the tears of those who believed no one ever saw them." The valley opened before them. It stretched farther than Jerome could see. Men, women, the elderly, the young, people from every nation and every age. Some sat alone upon stones. Some knelt with their faces hidden. Some simply stared into the distance, as though waiting for someone who never came. There were no chains, no fires, only unbearable loneliness. Jerome whispered, "Why doesn't anyone speak?" "They have convinced themselves," the guide replied, "that their voices no longer matter." As they walked among them, Jerome noticed something that broke his heart. Whenever one person began to rise, another would quietly pull away, not out of hatred, out of the fear of being disappointed again. The valley had become a place where hope itself was difficult to trust. A frail woman sat beside the road, clutching an empty bowl. Jerome knelt beside her. "Ma'am." She slowly looked up. Her eyes held neither anger nor fear, only exhaustion. "I have nothing left to give," she whispered. Jerome instinctively reached into his pocket. It was empty. He looked helplessly toward the guide. "I can't help her." The guide looked at him with gentle patience. "Must mercy always be purchased?" Jerome lowered his eyes. "No." He sat beside the woman instead. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jerome said, "I've felt empty too." The woman closed her eyes. "So have I." Nothing else was said, yet something changed. The bowl she held began to glow with a faint white light, not because it had been filled with food, but because someone had shared her burden. The woman smiled for the first time. "Thank you." Jerome blinked. "I didn't do anything. You stayed." The words lingered in the air. The guide continued walking. Many believe compassion is solving another person's pain. He looked back at Jerome. Often, it is simply refusing to leave. Farther into the valley, they came upon a child sitting beneath a leafless tree. He held a broken wooden bird in his hands. Its wing had snapped away. The child looked up. "Can you fix it?" Jerome accepted the toy. He searched for tools. Glue, string, anything. There was nothing. "I'm sorry," Jerome said. "I don't know how." The child smiled. "My father used to tell me." He carefully took the bird back. "That some things are repaired by hands." He placed the bird against his heart. "And some are repaired by love." The child hugged the broken toy. The missing wing slowly reappeared. Jerome stared in amazement. The child looked toward him. "You reminded me I wasn't alone." A soft radiance surrounded the child. The leafless tree blossomed with white flowers. Petals drifted gently through the valley. When Jerome looked again, the child was gone. Only the blossoms remained. The guide paused beneath the tree. "Do you understand?" Jerome looked around the valley. The cries had not disappeared, but here and there, small lights had begun to appear. Where someone listened, where someone forgave, where someone stayed, where someone chose mercy. Each act became another quiet flame pushing back the darkness. Jerome lifted the lantern. "I thought this light was given to me." The guide smiled. "It was." Jerome frowned. "But it grows brighter every time I help someone else." The guide nodded. "Light shared is light multiplied." The valley slowly disappeared behind them. Ahead stood an ancient bridge spanning a chasm so deep that no bottom could be seen. From below came voices, not crying, calling, whispering, tempting. Each voice spoke in a different tone. Each one sounded strangely familiar. Jerome tightened his grip on the lantern. "What is this place?" The guide's face grew solemn. "The Bridge of Echoes." Jerome looked into the darkness beneath it. The whispers became clearer. One voice sounded exactly like his own. "Come back." Another whispered, "You'll never make it." Another, "You're too weak." The guide stepped onto the bridge. Without looking back, he spoke the words Jerome was beginning to expect whenever fear rose in his heart. "Remember." Jerome steadied his breathing. The guide continued. "To get out." Jerome finished the sentence himself. "I must go through." Together they stepped onto the bridge as the whispers rose from the abyss below, testing not Jerome's feet, but the truth he had begun to believe about himself. Chapter 9. The Bridge of Echoes. The bridge swayed, not from wind. There was no wind. It moved because of the voices below. Each whisper rose from the darkness like smoke, curling around Jerome's feet before disappearing into the blackness above. The lantern's white flame remained steady. Its light reached only a few steps ahead. Nothing more. Jerome looked over the edge. He wished he hadn't. There was no bottom. Only an endless abyss where voices drifted upward. Some pleaded, some mocked. Some simply repeated the same sentence again, and again, and again. The guide stepped onto the bridge. "Do not look down for answers." Jerome followed. "What happens if I do?" The guide's face remained calm. "You begin believing the voices beneath you know the way." They had walked only a short distance when the first voice called his name. "Jerome!" He froze. It sounded exactly like his own. "You've always been a disappointment." His grip tightened around the lantern. The guide did not stop. "Keep walking." "But..." "Keep walking." Jerome obeyed. Another voice rose. "Remember your business?" The bridge beneath him shimmered. Suddenly, he wasn't standing above an abyss. He was back in his office. Employees packed boxes. Shelves stood empty. A bank representative slid foreclosure papers across the desk. "I trusted you," one employee said quietly. Another lowered his eyes. "I thought we'd retire here." Jerome felt his chest tighten. He remembered every face, every promise, every apology. The vision faded. The bridge returned. He dropped to one knee. "I failed them." The guide finally stopped. "You failed." He let the words settle. "But failure is an event." He looked directly at Jerome. "It is not your name." The bridge steadied. Jerome rose again. They continued. A new voice drifted upward. "What kind of husband lets his wife carry hope while he carries doubt?" Jerome's steps slowed. Images surrounded him, his wife smiling across the dinner table, praying over empty cupboards, quietly encouraging him after another rejection, never complaining, never leaving, never giving up. He lowered his head. "I've given her so little." The guide answered gently. "You have given her truth." Jerome looked confused. "I wish I had given her more." "So do I." The guide smiled. "But she did not marry your paycheck." He paused. "She married your heart." Jerome's eyes filled with tears, for the first time in many years. He believed those words. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. "You'll never change. You'll never get ahead. God has forgotten your address." The bridge trembled violently. Jerome nearly fell. The lantern flickered. Then another voice emerged. This one was different, soft, patient, almost kind. "Just stop hoping. No more disappointment. No more waiting. No more prayers. Accept that this is all life will ever be." Jerome stopped walking. Those words. Those were the most dangerous yet, because they offered peace without faith. He looked toward the guide. "I've thought that. I know. I've almost believed it. I know." The guide stepped closer. "There is a difference between being weary and surrendering your hope." Jerome closed his eyes. He remembered kneeling beside his bed. He remembered giving away his last meal. He remembered helping the stranger in the street. None of those moments had made him rich, but none of them had been wasted either. He opened his eyes. "No," the whisper returned. "No?" Jerome lifted the lantern. "I may grow tired." The light brightened. "I may stumble." The bridge became still. "I may even question." The darkness beneath them recoiled. "But I will not stop walking." The white flame burst outward, washing over the bridge like morning sunlight. Every whisper fell silent. For the first time, the abyss below knew stillness. The guide smiled. "You have crossed more than a bridge." Jerome looked around. "What do you mean?" "You have crossed the distance between believing that God owes you answers." He rested a hand on Jerome's shoulder. "And believing he is worthy of your trust, even when the answers have not yet come." Jerome stood quietly. The bridge ended at a massive stone arch carved into the face of a mountain. Upon it were words unlike any he had seen before. "The deeper the wound." Below it, in smaller letters, almost hidden by time, "The greater the healing may become." Beyond the arch lay a cavern illuminated by thousands of tiny lights, each no brighter than a candle. Jerome stared in wonder. "What are they?" The guide looked at the lights with quiet reverence. "They are the prayers people believed heaven never heard." Jerome's breath caught. "You mean?" The guide nodded. "Not one was lost." The cavern waited in silence. Jerome stepped toward it, carrying the lantern a little higher than before, his shoulders still bearing the weight of life's hardships, but no longer carrying them alone. Chapter 10. The Cavern of Unheard Prayers. The mountain swallowed them. Darkness closed behind Jerome as the stone arch slowly disappeared from sight. Only the lantern remained. And the lights. Thousands? No, millions. Tiny flames floated through the cavern like stars suspended in the night. Some burned brightly. Others flickered so softly Jerome wondered how they had not gone out. He reached toward one. The guide gently stopped him. "Not yet." "What are they?" The guide looked across the endless sea of light. "They are prayers." Jerome's heart quickened. the prayers of those who believed heaven never heard. Silence filled the cavern. Jerome whispered, "I have prayed thousands." "I know. Are they here too?" The guide smiled. "Walk." As they moved deeper into the cavern, the tiny lights drifted around them. Jerome noticed something strange. No two flames were alike. Some were clear and steady. Some carried a faint blue glow. Others shimmered with gold. Some looked as though they were barely alive. He frowned. "Why are they different?" "They tell different stories." The guide stopped beside a brilliant flame. This prayer was answered quickly. They walked a few more steps. He pointed to another. This one required years. Another. This one was answered in a way the one praying never expected. Jerome looked confused. "And these?" He pointed toward hundreds of lights that barely glowed at all. The guide's face became solemn. "These belong to those who stopped believing anyone was listening." Jerome felt his chest tighten. "They're fading." "They are. Can they die?" The guide looked directly at him. "Hope can." The words echoed through the cavern. "Hope can." Jerome lowered his eyes. He knew that feeling, far better than he wished. They continued until Jerome noticed something impossible. One flame was larger than all the others. It pulsed slowly, almost like a heartbeat. Without realizing it, he stepped toward it. The closer he came, the more familiar it felt. "What is this?" The guide answered quietly. "Touch it." Jerome hesitated, then gently placed his fingertips against the light. The cavern disappeared. He was back in his bedroom, on his knees, and years earlier. His business was thriving. His wife stood beside him. Together they prayed. "Lord," Jerome heard his younger voice, "never let success become more important than you." The vision faded. Another appeared. Jerome sitting alone in his truck after losing the business. "Father," his voice cracked, "if you don't restore the business, please don't let me lose myself." The light changed again. The pizza, the homeless family, the stranger in the street, every whispered prayer, every silent tear, every desperate cry he thought no one heard. Jerome stood frozen. "They're all here." The guide nodded. "Not one has been forgotten." Tears rolled down Jerome's face. "But why?" He struggled to speak. "Why didn't heaven answer?" The guide remained silent. Instead, another voice spoke behind them, gentle, warm, filled with quiet authority. "Who told you they were unanswered?" Jerome turned. An elderly traveler stood beside the great flame. His clothing was simple, his face weathered by time, yet a peaceful radiance surrounded him. He carried no staff, no crown, no sign of rank, only serenity. Jerome bowed his head instinctively. "I don't understand." The traveler smiled. "You asked for strength." Jerome nodded. "You were given opportunities to endure. You asked for wisdom. You were given failures to learn from. You asked for compassion. You were given people who needed mercy." Jerome's tears fell freely now. "I asked for provision." The traveler stepped closer. "And every day, you were given enough to choose generosity." Jerome covered his face. "I thought you were silent." The traveler gently shook his head. "No. You were listening for the answer, while heaven was shaping the man who could receive it." The cavern seemed brighter now. The elderly traveler looked toward the countless lights. "Understand this." His voice echoed gently through the mountain. "A delayed answer is not an abandoned prayer." He looked back at Jerome. "And sometimes the greatest miracle is not that your circumstances change. It is that your heart does." The radiance surrounding him slowly increased. Jerome wanted to ask who he was, but something deep inside told him not to. Some mysteries were gifts, not puzzles. The traveler smiled one final time. Then, like mist touched by the morning sun, he vanished. Only the great flame remained. Jerome stood without speaking. Finally, he whispered, "I've spent years asking heaven to change my life." The guide nodded. "And now?" Jerome looked at the sea of light stretching into eternity. "Now I think," he paused, "Oh, heaven has been changing me." The guide smiled. For the first time since their journey began, there was joy in his eyes. He turned toward a narrow passage leading out of the cavern. The next trial awaits. Jerome lifted the lantern. It no longer felt like something he was carrying. It felt like something burning within him. As they disappeared into the passage, the millions of tiny lights continued to shine behind them, a quiet testimony that not a single sincere prayer had ever been lost, even when the one praying believed heaven had been silent. Chapter 11. The Valley of Shadows. The passage narrowed until Jerome could no longer see the cavern behind him. Its warm light faded. Its quiet comfort disappeared. Only the white lantern remained. Its flame burned steadily in Jerome's hand. For the first time since the journey began, he noticed something. The flame no longer seemed to come from the lantern. It came from him. The guide glanced over his shoulder. "You've noticed?" Jerome nodded slowly. "I thought I was carrying the light." "You were," the guide smiled. "But now, the light is teaching you how to carry yourself." The tunnel opened into a valley unlike any Jerome had seen. It was covered in shadows, not darkness, shadows. Every hill, every stone, every tree, each cast a shadow far larger than the object itself. Jerome frowned. "That doesn't make sense." The guide quietly replied, "Fear never does." A cold wind swept across the valley. It carried voices, not accusations, predictions. "You'll lose everything. Your wife will grow tired of waiting. Your body will fail. You'll die with nothing. Your dreams are already over." Jerome felt his heartbeat quicken. He knew these voices. They had kept him awake for years. "Are they real?" he asked. The guide looked toward the distant hills. "They are possibilities." Jerome swallowed. "So they could happen?" "They could." The answer surprised him. "You mean you're not going to tell me everything will work out?" The guide stopped walking. "No." Jerome stared. The guide's eyes were kind. "I will tell you something better." "What?" "No matter what happens, God will not leave you." Silence settled between them. Jerome realized that wasn't the promise he wanted. It was the promise he needed. They continued. Ahead stood hundreds of travelers. Each faced a different shadow. One shadow looked like illness, another like poverty, another like loneliness, another like failure. Yet Jerome noticed something remarkable. The shadows never moved. The travelers did. Some stood frozen, unable to take another step. Others walked directly through the darkness. The moment they did, the shadow disappeared. Jerome looked at the guide. They weren't real. They were. Then what happened? They lost their power the moment someone stopped running from them. Jerome took a deep breath. His own shadow appeared before him. It rose from the ground until it towered over the valley. Its eyes were his. Its voice was his. Its face was his. Only older, more tired, more bitter. The shadow smiled. "So, then we meet again." Jerome's hands trembled. "You've walked with me a long time." The shadow nodded. "Since the day your business closed." It circled him slowly. "I've watched every sleepless night, every rejection, every unpaid bill, every prayer that felt unanswered." The shadow leaned close. "I've been honest with you?" Jerome shook his head. "No." "You've been loud." The shadow laughed. "And yet, you always listened." Jerome looked toward the guide. "What do I do?" The guide did not answer. Instead, he pointed to the lantern. Jerome looked down. The white flame burned peacefully, not larger, not brighter, simply steady. He understood. Slowly, Jerome stepped forward. The shadow grew. Another step. It became enormous. Another. It roared with a voice that shook the valley. "Turn back!" Jerome flinched, but he did not stop. Another step. The shadow began shrinking. Another. Its voice weakened. Another. The towering giant became no larger than an ordinary man. Jerome stood face to face with it. The shadow whispered one last time, "Aren't you afraid?" Jerome smiled through tears. Every day. The shadow waited. Jerome lifted the lantern. But I'm done letting fear decide where I walk. The white flame touched the shadow's chest. There was no explosion, no battle, no violence. The shadow simply dissolved. Like morning mist beneath the rising sun, the valley became quiet. The cold wind ceased. Far across the hills, other travelers began taking their first steps. One by one, their shadows disappeared as well. The guide placed a hand on Jerome's shoulder. What have you learned? Jerome looked across the valley. He thought about his business, his marriage, his failures, his prayers, his fears. Then he answered, courage isn't walking without fear. He looked at the path ahead. It's choosing to obey even while fear is walking beside you. The guide's smile widened. Now, he pointed toward a distant mountain whose peak disappeared into clouds of brilliant white. Now you are ready to begin the ascent. Jerome stared upward. The mountain seemed impossibly high. What is it called? The guide's voice became almost a whisper. The mountain of waiting? Jerome sighed. I've spent years waiting. The guide nodded. I know. He turned toward the winding trail. But you've never learned how to wait with hope. Together they began climbing, one step at a time, toward the mountain where Jerome would discover that some of heaven's greatest works are accomplished not in moments of action, but in seasons of waiting. Chapter 12. The Mountain of Waiting. The mountain did not challenge Jerome's strength. It challenged his patience. Its path was narrow, winding endlessly upward through cliffs of gray stone. No shortcuts appeared. No hidden passages revealed themselves. Only the next step, and then the one after that. Jerome looked toward the summit. It seemed no closer than when they had begun. Are we making any progress? The guide smiled. More than you know. It doesn't feel like it. Growth seldom does. They climbed in silence. Hours or perhaps days passed. Time had become strange in this place. Jerome no longer measured it by clocks. He measured it by lessons. Around the next bend they found a man sitting on a weathered stone. He held a walking staff worn smooth by years of use. His robes were simple. His face bore deep lines, not from worry, but from a lifetime of endurance. A quiet radiance rested upon him like the first light before dawn. He looked up and smiled. You've grown weary. Jerome laughed softly. I've been weary for years. The old traveler nodded knowingly. So had I. Jerome sat beside him. What kept you walking? The traveler looked toward the mountain peak. A promise. Jerome sighed. What if you can't see the promise anymore? The traveler gently tapped his staff against the ground. Then you remember the one who made it. Jerome lowered his head. I've prayed for my life to change. The traveler was silent for a long moment. Then he asked, Has your heart changed? Jerome didn't answer. Because he already knew. The traveler continued. When a seed is buried, it is not forgotten. It is being prepared. He picked up a tiny seed resting between two stones and placed it in Jerome's palm. If the seed could speak, it might believe the darkness was its grave. He smiled. When in truth, it was only the beginning of its growth. Jerome closed his fingers around the seed. Tears filled his eyes. I've spent so much time asking God, when? The traveler nodded. And heaven has been asking, will you trust me until then? A gentle breeze passed over the mountain. The traveler's radiance grew brighter. Before Jerome could ask another question, the old man stood. Do not despise small beginnings. He looked warmly into Jerome's eyes. The mountain is climbed, one faithful step at a time. The light surrounding him slowly rose like morning mist. Within moments, he was gone. Only the walking staff remained leaning against the stone. Jerome looked toward the guide. Another servant. The guide nodded. Another lesson. Jerome carefully placed the tiny seed inside his shirt pocket. I think, he paused, searching for the right words. I've spent years believing waiting meant God was doing nothing. The guide looked toward the summit. And now? Jerome smiled faintly. Now I think Waiting may be where he does his deepest work. The guide's eyes reflected quiet joy. They continued upward. The air became thinner, cooler, cleaner. For the first time since entering this mysterious realm, Jerome smelled something unexpected. Fresh bread, rain, wildflowers. Home. He closed his eyes. It smells like... The guide finished the sentence. Hope! They rounded one final bend. Jerome stopped in amazement. Before them stood a narrow stone terrace overlooking everything they had crossed. The Valley of Forgotten Tears, the Bridge of Echoes, the City of Choices, the mountain itself. All of it lay beneath them now. It was never just about getting through, Jerome whispered. The guide stood beside him. No, it was about becoming someone who could. Jerome looked toward the horizon. Far beyond the mountain, hidden beneath rolling clouds, stood an enormous pair of ancient doors. Unlike every gate before them, these were scarred, burned, splintered. They looked as though they had withstood countless battles. Above them, carved in weathered stone, were words that caused Jerome's heart to race. The trial of forgiveness. The guide's expression grew solemn. You have faced fear. You have faced despair. You have faced yourself. He looked directly at Jerome. But the next path, he paused, will ask you to release what you've carried longer than you realize. Jerome stared at the distant gates. He had a feeling this trial would not ask him to forgive strangers. It would ask him to forgive people whose names he still remembered. And perhaps someone else, the man he had never truly forgiven, himself. Chapter 13. The Trial of Forgiveness. The ancient doors opened slowly, not with the sound of grinding stone, but with the sound of breaking chains. Jerome stepped through. The air changed. The heat was gone. The cold was gone. Everything here felt heavy, as though every breath carried the weight of unfinished conversations. The valley before him was covered with olive trees, their branches twisted in every direction. Some were green with life. Others were black and lifeless. Between them wound a narrow path of white stone. No voices called his name. No shadows mocked him. No temptations whispered. Only silence. Jerome looked at the guide. This place feels different. It is. Why? Because bitterness seldom announces itself. The guide bent down and picked up a smooth stone. He handed it to Jerome. Carry this. Jerome turned it over in his hand. It was ordinary, hardly heavier than an apple. What is it? Walk. They had not gone 100 yards before Jerome noticed the stone had grown heavier. He shifted it to his other hand. Another 100 yards, and it grew heavier still. Soon he carried it with both hands. His shoulders tightened. His breathing became labored. This doesn't make sense. The guide kept walking. It makes perfect sense. Jerome stumbled. By the time they reached the next rise, the stone weighed as much as a sack of concrete. He dropped to one knee. I can't carry this. The guide looked at him kindly. You already have. Jerome frowned. What do you mean? For years. The words settled over him like morning fog. The guide pointed toward the valley below. Figures were beginning to appear among the trees. Not ghosts, not spirits. Memories. Jerome recognized the first immediately. The business partner who had quietly emptied accounts before disappearing. The betrayal that helped destroy everything Jerome had spent decades building. Anger rose before he could stop it. The stone became heavier. Another figure appeared. A man who had promised work, then vanished without returning a call. Heavier, another. A family member whose careless words had wounded him years before. Heavier. A church leader who had preached about faith on Sunday, yet ignored struggling families the rest of the week. Heavier. Jerome's knees buckled. The stone crushed against his chest. I can't. The guide knelt beside him. No, you won't. Jerome looked up. They don't deserve forgiveness. The guide nodded. Some don't. Then why? The guide placed a hand upon the stone. Forgiveness is not pretending evil never happened. It is refusing to carry someone else's sin for the rest of your life. Jerome looked at the faces around him. Old wounds reopened, Old conversations replayed. Old disappointments returned. He realized something. Every face still had power over him. Not because they remained in his life, because they still lived inside his heart. The guide spoke softly. "Who is imprisoned?" Jerome answered without thinking. "They are." The guide gently shook his head. "No." Jerome closed his eyes. He understood. He was. Slowly, very slowly, he lowered the stone to the ground. Nothing happened. The valley remained silent. The guide waited. Jerome looked toward the first man. "I cannot say what you did was right." His voice trembled. "I cannot pretend it didn't hurt." A tear rolled down his cheek. "But I release my right to keep reliving it." The stone cracked. A thin line of white light appeared. Jerome turned toward the others. One by one, he spoke. Not long speeches, simple truths. "I release you. I leave justice to God. I refuse to let this define the rest of my life." Each time, another crack, another beam of light, until only one figure remained. Jerome froze. The man before him looked familiar. Too familiar. He wore tired eyes, shoulders bent beneath invisible burdens. His face carried years of disappointment. Jerome slowly realized he was looking at himself. Not the Jerome standing there. The Jerome who had lost hope. The Jerome who believed he had failed everyone. The Jerome who whispered he wished he had never been born. The broken Jerome looked at him with shame. "I ruined everything." Jerome felt his heart breaking. For a long time. Neither moved. Finally, Jerome stepped forward. He placed a hand upon the broken man's shoulder. "You made mistakes." The man nodded. "You failed." Another nod. "But you kept getting back up." Jerome smiled through tears. "And I'm proud of you for that." The broken Jerome began to weep. The light inside the cracked stone burst forth. It did not blind. It healed. The broken image dissolved into thousands of tiny lights that rose into the branches above. Suddenly, the dead olive trees bloomed. Fresh leaves covered black limbs. White blossoms filled the valley. The weight disappeared. Jerome looked down. The stone had become dust. The guide stood beside him. "What have you learned?" Jerome watched the blossoms drift upon the breeze. "I thought forgiveness was setting someone else free." He smiled quietly. "It was setting me free." The guide nodded. "Then one final truth remains before the last ascent." He pointed toward a distant ridge where dawn seemed to touch the horizon for the first time. Beyond it, the light was brighter than Jerome had yet seen. The journey was not over. But for the first time since the earth opened beneath his feet, Jerome no longer walked like a man trying to escape. He walked like a man who was finally becoming free. Chapter 14. The Last Idol. The path beyond the valley of forgiveness was unlike any Jerome had walked before. There was no smoke, no sulfur, no cries from distant souls, only a narrow trail leading toward a solitary hill. At its summit stood a single tree. Its trunk was scarred, its branches stretched toward heaven. Its roots disappeared into stone. The guide slowed his pace. "Many travelers believe this is the easiest trial." Jerome looked around. "I don't understand." "There are no monsters. No. No shadows. No. No voices." The guide looked at him. "Because not every battle announces itself." They climbed together. The closer Jerome came to the tree, the more peaceful everything became. Even the silence felt gentle. Then he noticed something beneath its branches. A table. Upon it rested objects from an ordinary life. A set of truck keys, a worn Bible, a wedding ring, an old wallet, a photograph of his wife, a framed picture of his business on opening day, a pair of work gloves, a child's drawing someone had once given him years ago. Jerome stopped breathing. "These are mine. They represent your life." The guide stood back. "Sit." Jerome lowered himself onto the weathered bench beside the table. "What am I supposed to do?" "Answer. No one has asked me anything." The guide looked toward the sky. "He has." Silence followed, long enough for Jerome to hear only the beating of his own heart. Then, a breeze moved through the tree. Its leaves whispered. Not words, memories. He remembered opening his business, holding his wife's hand at their wedding, his first paycheck, his first great loss, his first answered prayer, his first unanswered one, his mother teaching him to pray, his father telling him, "A man's character is revealed when no one is watching." Tears welled in his eyes. The guide finally spoke. "What have you asked God for most?" Jerome answered honestly, "Provision. And after that, relief. And after that?" Jerome stared at the table. "To let me win." The guide nodded. "There is nothing sinful about those prayers." Jerome looked up. "Then why am I here?" The guide's expression became thoughtful. "Because there is one question every soul must answer." The breeze stopped. Even the leaves became still. The guide's voice softened. "If none of it returned," he pointed toward the business, "would you still trust him?" He pointed toward the wallet. "If you remain poor," he pointed toward the photograph of Jerome's wife. "If suffering continued," finally, he pointed toward Jerome's own heart. "If all you possessed was God, would he still be enough?" Jerome felt as though the world had stopped turning. No demon had ever frightened him like that question. He wanted to answer immediately, and he wanted to shout, "Yes!" But the word caught in his throat. Because he wasn't certain, he lowered his head. "I don't know." The guide smiled. For the first time, he looked pleased by Jerome's answer. "Why are you smiling?" "Because false faith answers too quickly." Jerome sat quietly. Minutes passed, or hours. He no longer cared. He picked up the photograph of his business. He smiled sadly. "I love this." He laid it back upon the table. He picked up his wallet. "I worried over this." He laid it down. He picked up the truck keys. "I depended on this." He laid them down. Finally, he picked up the photograph of his wife. He held it for a long time. A tear landed upon the picture. "I thank God for every day I have with you." He gently kissed the edge of the photograph, then placed it back on the table. The guide watched without interrupting. Jerome looked toward heaven. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I still hope you'll provide. I still hope life gets easier. I still pray for better days." He smiled through tears. "But if all I ever receive is another sunrise, another day with my wife, and another chance to serve you," he closed his eyes, "then let me never mistake your presence for poverty." The wind returned. The great tree burst into bloom. Thousands of white blossoms covered every branch. The table disappeared. The photographs, the keys, the wallet, everything dissolved into light. Only the guide and Jerome remained. The guide looked at him with quiet joy. "You have released the last idol." Jerome frowned. "I didn't worship those things." "No." The guide's voice was gentle. "You simply believed they were necessary before you could have peace." Jerome stood. For the first time since entering this mysterious realm, he felt lighter than when he had arrived. Not because his questions had all been answered, but because he no longer needed every answer to keep walking. Ahead, the mountain ended. Beyond it stretched a vast plain bathed in a brilliance unlike anything Jerome had yet seen. He shielded his eyes. "What is beyond that light?" The guide's face became solemn once more. "The place where every journey ends." He paused. "And where yours will be decided." Jerome took a slow breath. He knew. The final question was drawing near, and somewhere beyond that light, the reason heaven had brought him here was waiting. Chapter 15. The Plain of Decision. Jerome stepped beyond the mountain. The brilliance before him did not blind his eyes. It searched his heart. The vast plain stretched farther than the horizon, covered in grass that shimmered like silver beneath a sky unlike any he had seen. There was no crimson here, no smoke, no sulfur, only quiet, a peace so profound it almost frightened him. He looked behind. The mountain had disappeared. The valleys, the bridge, the city, the trials, all were hidden beyond a veil of mist. "They're gone," Jerome whispered. The guide shook his head. "No, they are part of you now." Jerome looked ahead. In the center of the plain stood a single chair carved from weathered olive wood. Beside it rested a basin of clear water. Nothing else. No gate? Jerome asked. No monster? No. No trial? The guide smiled gently. The greatest trials seldom look like trials. They walked toward the chair. When Jerome reached it, he noticed something etched into the wood. Sit only if you seek truth more than comfort. He looked at the guide. What happens if I sit? You will see yourself. Jerome lowered himself into the chair. Nothing happened. For several moments. Only silence. Then the water in the basin began to move. Not with ripples, with memories. Jerome watched scenes from his life pass across its surface. His first bicycle, his mother's embrace, his wedding day, the birth of dreams, the collapse of dreams, the stranger in the street, the slice of pizza, the construction site, the earthquake. Every moment flowed together like a river. Then, the water stopped. One memory remained, the stranger collapsing across the street. Jerome watched himself cross traffic while everyone else hurried past. He remembered the irritation, the exhaustion, the thoughts that had filled his mind only moments before. Yet, he had still stopped. He had still knelt. He had still helped. The guide finally spoke. Why? Jerome stared at the water. I don't know. You expected nothing in return. I know. You were carrying your own burdens. I was. You almost cursed heaven. I did. The guide leaned closer. Then why did you stop? Jerome searched his own heart. I couldn't leave him. The guide nodded. That answer matters. The water changed again. Now Jerome saw every small act of kindness he had forgotten. Holding a door, buying groceries for someone embarrassed at the checkout, calling a lonely neighbor, praying quietly for strangers, giving rides, sharing meals, encouraging someone when he himself was discouraged. Most of them he had completely forgotten. Jerome looked puzzled. Why am I seeing these? Because you never counted them. The guide smiled. Heaven did. Jerome lowered his head. I always thought my life amounted to so little. The guide's voice carried both gentleness and authority. You measured your life by what you accumulated. He paused. Heaven measured it by what you gave away. Tears streamed down Jerome's face. He had spent years believing he had nothing. Yet the basin revealed a life overflowing with quiet acts of mercy. Not perfect, not famous, not wealthy, faithful. The guide stepped toward the basin. Tell me, Jerome, if heaven granted you one request, what would you ask? Jerome smiled faintly. Months ago, he knew exactly what he would have said. Money, success, a restored business, security. Now, he looked across the endless plain. He thought of his wife, of the radiant travelers, of every lesson, of every trial. Finally, he answered, I would ask, his voice trembled, that when people meet me, they leave believing you are kinder than they imagine. Silence covered the plain. The guide closed his eyes. A smile spread across his face, not because Jerome had found the perfect words, but because they were true. Far in the distance, a trumpet sounded, not loud, not frightening, hopeful. The air itself seemed to rejoice. The guide looked toward the horizon where an immense light slowly began to rise. It is almost time. Jerome stood. His heart was strangely calm. For what? The guide looked at him with affection that seemed older than the stars. For the question you have been answering since the day you gave away your last $5. Together they turned toward the growing light. Neither spoke another word. None was needed. The journey had never been about reaching the light. It had always been about allowing the light to reach Jerome. Chapter 16. The final question. The light rose slowly. It did not rush across the plain. It waited. Jerome and the guide walked toward it in silence. The grass beneath their feet shimmered with every step, bending gently as though creation itself recognized the one whose presence drew near. There was no fear in Jerome now, only reverence. Ahead stood a doorway, unlike any he had seen before. It had no walls, no frame, no hinges. It was simply an opening filled with brilliant light. Beyond it, he could not see. The guide stopped. "We go no farther together." Jerome looked at him. "You aren't coming." "My road ends here." Jerome's heart sank. "I don't want to do this alone." The guide smiled gently. "You are not alone." The words sounded familiar now. Jerome realized they had been true every step of the journey. A voice came from within the light. It was neither loud nor soft. It carried no anger, no accusation. Only perfect authority wrapped in perfect compassion. "Jerome!" He fell to one knee. "Rise." He stood. The voice spoke again. "You have crossed valleys. You have endured waiting. You have faced fear. You have released bitterness. You have learned mercy." A pause followed. "But none of those was your final trial." Jerome listened without speaking. The voice continued. "The final trial is love." The plane became still. "So answer. If you returned to the world exactly as you left it, if your debts remained, if your work remained uncertain, if your body still grew weary, if your prayers were still answered in my time and not yours." The light seemed to surround Jerome without consuming him. "Would you still walk with me?" Jerome closed his eyes. Months ago, his answer would have depended on hope for a better tomorrow. Now, he thought of everything he had seen: the forgotten prayers, the lonely, the broken, the frightened, the radiant servants, the guide, his wife waiting faithfully at home. He opened his eyes. "Yes." Not loudly, not dramatically, simply, "Yes," the voice asked again. "Why?" Jerome smiled through tears. "Because I finally understand." The light waited. "I thought I loved you because you blessed me." He shook his head. "I thought I trusted you because I believed you would fix everything." Another tear rolled down his face. "But if I have learned anything, it is that you were with me when I thought you were silent. You were near when I thought you were distant. You were shaping me when I thought nothing was happening." He took a slow breath. "I don't follow you because life is easy. I follow you because you are worthy." Silence, then the light became warmer, not brighter, warmer. The voice spoke one final time. "Then hear what every weary soul longs to know." Jerome's heart pounded. "I have never wasted one tear you cried. I have never forgotten one prayer you whispered. I have never overlooked one act of mercy. I was with you in every disappointment. I was with you in every rejection. I was with you when you believed you stood alone." The words settled deep within him. "So remember this when you return." The light began to recede. Faith is not proven when the road is easy. It is proven when love remains after every expectation has been surrendered. Jerome bowed his head. "I understand." "No," the voice answered gently. "You have begun to." The doorway slowly closed. The plane faded. The guide stepped beside Jerome once more. There were tears in the guide's eyes. "One question remains." Jerome looked at him. "What question?" The guide smiled. "The one you've wanted to ask since the beginning." Jerome looked at the familiar face that had walked beside him through every trial. He finally whispered the words that had waited in his heart since the street where they first met. "Who are you?" The guide did not answer. Instead, he smiled. And for the first time since Jerome had entered this extraordinary journey, light began to shine from within him. Chapter 17. The Stranger on the Street. The light did not burst from the guide. It unfolded, like dawn breaking over a world that had waited through the longest night. Jerome instinctively stepped back, not because he was afraid, because he suddenly understood that he was standing in the presence of someone whose kindness was far greater than his power. The guide remained dressed as he always had: simple work boots, dust-covered clothing, weathered hands. Nothing about him demanded attention. Everything about him invited trust. Jerome whispered, "It was you." The guide smiled. "It was." The man who collapsed in the street? Yes. The one everyone walked past? Yes. Jerome's voice trembled. I almost walked past too. The guide nodded. But you didn't. A long silence settled between them. Jerome searched his face. Were you sent to test me? The guide looked toward the fading plane. No. I was sent to meet you. Jerome frowned. I don't understand. You believe your journey began when the earth opened beneath the house. He smiled gently. It began long before that. The guide slowly raised his hand. The light around them changed. Jerome saw moments from his own life. Not the great moments, the ordinary ones. He saw himself stopping to help an elderly man load groceries into his truck. He had forgotten that day. He saw himself praying with a coworker whose mother had died. He barely remembered that conversation. He saw himself mowing a neighbor's lawn after surgery. He saw himself giving away an old coat on a freezing morning. He saw himself sitting beside a lonely man in a hospital waiting room simply because no one else would. Hundreds of moments, small moments, hidden moments. Jerome covered his mouth. I forgot all of these. The guide nodded. You did. Heaven did not. The scenes continued. Jerome noticed something else. In every memory, someone unexpected was nearby. A stranger in a crowd, a man sitting quietly on a bench, a worker across the street, a traveler at a gas station, never speaking, always watching. Jerome looked at the guide. That was, the guide answered softly. Sometimes. You were there? When I was permitted. Jerome stood speechless. I never saw you. The guide smiled. You weren't meant to. Jerome lowered his eyes. I kept asking where God was. The guide stepped closer. And many times, he answered with a person. The words settled deeply into Jerome's heart. The guide continued. You expected thunder. You searched for miracles. You waited for doors to fly open. He looked into Jerome's eyes, but heaven often moves quietly. In a faithful wife, in an encouraging friend, in a stranger who stops, in someone who shares their last meal, in a hand stretched toward another without expecting anything in return. Jerome remembered the $5 slice of pizza, the homeless family, his empty stomach, the anger that followed. The guide spoke as though reading his thoughts. You believed that meal had been wasted. Jerome nodded. It wasn't. No act of mercy is ever wasted. But they drove away in a luxury vehicle. The guide smiled knowingly. And what did that reveal? Jerome thought for a long time. Finally he answered. It revealed my heart. The guide nodded. The gift was never the lesson. Your response was... Jerome looked down. I almost cursed heaven. You did not. I wanted to. I know. Jerome's voice broke. I was ashamed. The guide gently placed a hand on his shoulder. The Father knew your weariness before you spoke a single word. He is not surprised by exhausted hearts. He is near them. Jerome closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he no longer felt ashamed to admit how deeply he had struggled. The guide slowly withdrew his hand. My time with you is ending. Jerome's heart sank. I don't want you to leave. The guide smiled warmly. I never belonged to you. He pointed upward, not to the sky, but beyond it. I belong to the one who sent me. Jerome swallowed. Will I ever see you again? The guide's eyes shone with quiet hope. When your race is finished, yeah, we shall meet where no goodbyes are spoken. Tears filled Jerome's eyes and he stepped forward. Without thinking, he embraced the man who had walked beside him through every trial. The guide returned the embrace, strong, steady, like a father welcoming home a weary son. As Jerome stepped back, the light surrounding the guide grew brighter, not dazzling, beautiful, peaceful. His outline slowly faded into the radiance. Before he disappeared completely, he spoke one final sentence. When you return, look carefully. Jerome listened. You will discover that heaven has placed more companions along your road than you ever imagined. The light rose, the plane vanished. The guide was gone. Jerome stood alone, or so he thought. Then a familiar warmth settled over his heart. Not a voice, not a vision, only the quiet certainty that had carried him through every trial. He had never walked alone, and he never would. Chapter 18. The breath of earth. Light. It was the first thing Jerome felt, not saw, felt, warm, gentle, living. He drew a sudden breath. Dust filled his lungs. He coughed violently. The taste of dirt and broken concrete flooded his mouth. Voices echoed somewhere above him. "He's alive! I've got movement! Easy, easy!" Hands reached through splintered beams. A firefighter pulled away a section of lumber. Another slipped an oxygen mask over Jerome's face. "Stay with us." Jerome blinked. Sunlight, real sunlight. It poured through the broken roof of the collapsed house. He stared upward. Blue sky, white clouds, wind moving through nearby trees. He had never imagined ordinary things could look so beautiful. Tears slipped from the corners of his eyes. A paramedic leaned over him. "Can you hear me?" Jerome nodded weakly. "What day is it?" The paramedic exchanged a puzzled glance with another rescuer. "Thursday." Jerome frowned. "Thursday? You've only been trapped a few minutes." A few minutes. His heart pounded. It had felt like weeks, perhaps months. He closed his eyes. The valleys, the bridge, the mountain, the guide, the light. Had it all been? He reached instinctively into his shirt pocket. His fingers touched something. A tiny seed. The one placed in his hand high upon the mountain of waiting. He froze. Carefully, he removed it. It rested in his palm. Small, ordinary, real. No one else seemed to notice. Jerome quietly closed his hand around it. His eyes filled again. It wasn't a dream. The ambulance doors closed. Sirens began to wail. As the vehicle pulled away, Jerome looked through the rear windows. Workers stood silently around the sinkhole. Some embraced, some prayed, some simply stared in disbelief. Then, near the edge of the crowd, he saw a familiar figure. Simple work boots, dust-covered clothes, hands folded quietly before him. The stranger smiled. Only once, then turned and disappeared into the gathering crowd. Jerome sat upright. "Wait!" The paramedic gently pressed him back. "Easy. There was a man." "What man?" "The one." Jerome looked through the glass again. No one. Only rescuers, police, neighbors. The stranger was gone. Jerome smiled through tears. "I know." The paramedic looked confused. "You know what?" Jerome slowly shook his head. "Nothing." He wasn't hiding the truth. He simply knew some experiences were too sacred for explanation. Several hours later, Jerome sat alone in a hospital room, bruised and exhausted, alive. Doctors called him fortunate. Engineers called it impossible. News reporters called it miraculous. Jerome called it mercy. The door opened. His wife stepped inside. The moment she saw him, she ran, no words, no questions. She wrapped her arms around him and held him as though she feared he might disappear. Jerome held her tightly, for a long time. Neither spoke. Finally, she whispered against his shoulder, "I thought I'd lost you." Jerome gently kissed her forehead. "You almost did." She leaned back and searched his face. Something was different. The worry lines remained. The gray in his beard remained. The bruises remained. Yet his eyes held a peace she had never seen before. She smiled softly. "What happened to you?" Jerome laughed quietly. "I walked a very long road." She assumed the medication was talking. She smiled anyway. "I've been praying all day." Jerome reached for her hand. "I know." She tilted her head. "How?" He looked at her with tears of gratitude. "Because every prayer—" He squeezed her hand gently. "We is heard." She looked at him in silence. She didn't fully understand. Not yet, but she believed him. Because the man sitting before her was not the same man who had left for work that morning. That evening, after the nurses dimmed the lights and the room grew quiet, Jerome looked out the hospital window. The city lights shimmered below. People hurried home. Cars filled the streets. Life continued, just as it always had. Yet everything had changed. He opened his hand. The tiny seed rested in his palm. He smiled. Then he whispered a prayer unlike any he had prayed before. Father. He looked toward the night sky. Thank you. Nothing more. Nothing less. For the first time in years, he asked for nothing. Because for the first time in years, he understood that God's greatest gift had never been the life Jerome wanted. It had been God's faithful presence through the life Jerome was given. Chapter 19, The Morning After. Morning arrived quietly. No trumpets, no visions, no radiant light filled the hospital room. Only the soft glow of sunrise spilling through the window. Jerome watched it in silence. For years he had awakened wondering how he would survive another day. This morning, he wondered who might need kindness before the day was over. The thought surprised him. A nurse entered carrying a breakfast tray. "Good morning," she said with a tired smile. Jerome noticed the dark circles beneath her eyes. "Long night?" She laughed softly. "Very." He smiled. "Thank you for taking care of me." She paused. It was such a simple sentence, yet something in it caught her off guard. "You don't know how much I needed to hear that." She quietly wiped away a tear before leaving the room. Jerome watched the door close. The guide's words echoed in his heart. Heaven often moves quietly. 2 days later, Jerome returned home. Nothing had changed. The mailbox was still full of bills. The truck still needed repairs. The refrigerator was still nearly empty. The mortgage was still overdue. He stood in the kitchen looking at everything that had once stolen his peace. His wife wrapped her arms around his waist. "Welcome home." He turned and smiled. "It really is." She studied him carefully. "Aren't you worried?" He looked at the stack of envelopes. "I'll deal with them. One at a time." She blinked. "That's it?" Jerome nodded. "That's enough for today." For the first time in years, the bills no longer felt like chains. They were simply problems, and problems could be faced. The following week, Jerome returned to work. Not a dream job, not great pay, just honest work. As he swept sawdust from the floor of a construction site, one of the younger workers complained, "My whole life is falling apart." Jerome leaned on his broom. "Tell me about it." The young man laughed. "You wouldn't understand." Jerome smiled gently. "You'd be surprised." They sat together during lunch. For nearly an hour, Jerome listened. He offered no speeches, no easy answers, only his attention. When the conversation ended, the young worker stood. "I feel lighter." Jerome smiled. "So do I." Weeks became months. Jerome and his wife slowly paid off one bill, then another. Some months they moved forward. Some months they slipped backward. But something had changed forever. Jerome no longer measured God's faithfulness by the size of his bank account. He measured it by daily bread, by strength for another sunrise, by the laughter he shared with his wife over simple meals, by unexpected opportunities, by peace that had no logical explanation. One evening, while driving home from work, traffic slowed. Ahead, an elderly man struggled to push a disabled car out of the roadway. Dozens of vehicles drove around him. Jerome smiled. He pulled onto the shoulder. Without hesitation, he climbed out and walked toward the stranger. As he placed his hands against the car, he quietly laughed to himself. His wife looked at him curiously. "What's so funny?" Jerome shook his head. "Nothing." Then he looked toward heaven. "Well, almost nothing." Together, they pushed the car safely to the side of the road. The elderly man thanked them repeatedly. Jerome simply smiled. "It was my privilege." As they drove away, his wife looked back through the rear window. "That gentleman disappeared." Jerome glanced in the mirror. The roadside was empty, no car, no man. Only an open stretch of highway glowing beneath the setting sun. His wife frowned. "Did you see that?" Jerome smiled. "I think." He looked toward the horizon. "We're never quite as alone as we think." That night, before going to bed, Jerome opened the small Bible that had rested untouched for many months before his journey. A tiny object slipped from between its pages. The seed. He held it in his palm, then walked outside. Under the fading light of evening, he knelt beside the old oak tree in the backyard. He pressed the tiny seed into the earth, covered it gently, and whispered, "Grow." Not because he expected a miracle by morning, but because he had learned that the greatest things God creates often begin where no one is watching. Jerome stood. He took his wife's hand. Together they walked back toward the house. The camera of heaven, unseen by human eyes, lingered on the small patch of freshly turned earth. A soft breeze passed. The ground stirred almost imperceptibly. Then, far beyond the stars, beyond time, beyond every trial Jerome had endured, a familiar voice spoke with quiet joy. "He came through." And the light answered, "Yes, he did." The night settled peacefully over the little house. The bills remained. The work remained. Life remained. But so did faith. And this time, faith remained unshaken. To get out, he had gone through. Epilogue. Through. Years passed. The seed never became the tallest tree in Jerome's yard. It didn't need to. Every spring it reminded him that life often begins beneath the surface, where no one is looking. The business was never rebuilt the way it had once been. Another opportunity came, then another. Some succeeded, some failed. There were still months when money was tight. There were still unexpected bills. There were still nights when sleep was difficult. Jerome had not been given a life without storms. He had been given something far greater. He had been given an anchor. People began noticing, not because Jerome preached louder, not because he claimed to have visited impossible places. In fact, he never told anyone about the journey. Who would believe him? Instead, people noticed that he no longer panicked when life became uncertain. He no longer envied those who prospered through dishonesty. He no longer measured himself by what he owned. When someone suffered, he stayed. When someone cried, he listened. When someone stumbled, he reached for them. Without realizing it, Jerome became the answer to many of the prayers he had once prayed for himself. One autumn afternoon, a young man knocked on Jerome's front door. His shoulders were slumped. His eyes were hollow. He looked painfully familiar. Jerome invited him inside. They sat at the same kitchen table where unpaid bills had once stolen so many nights of peace. The young man buried his face in his hands. "I've lost everything." Jerome remained quiet. "I don't know what to do." Jerome nodded gently. "I know that feeling." The young man looked up. "You do?" Jerome smiled. "Better than you think." For hours they talked. Jerome never mentioned the inferno. He never spoke of radiant travelers. He never described the guide. Instead, he spoke of faith, of waiting, of mercy, of choosing hope when hope seemed unreasonable. As the young man prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you help me?" Jerome looked toward the evening sky, then back at the young man. "Because one day, someone crossed the road for me." The young man smiled, though he did not fully understand. He thanked Jerome and disappeared down the sidewalk. Jerome watched until he was out of sight. Then he quietly stepped onto the front porch. The setting sun painted the neighborhood in gold. Children laughed in the distance. A neighbor waved. Someone struggled to carry groceries across the street. Without thinking, Jerome walked over to help. As he reached for one of the heavy bags, he noticed an older man standing farther down the sidewalk. Simple clothes, dusty boots, kind eyes. The man tipped his head ever so slightly. A familiar smile crossed his face. Jerome smiled back. He blinked. The sidewalk was empty. He laughed softly. Not because he had seen a miracle, but because he no longer needed one to believe. He looked toward heaven. "Thank you for never leaving." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the little tree growing in his yard. Its branches, though still young, stretched confidently toward the sky. Jerome took his wife's hand. Together they walked inside. The door closed. The porch grew still. And the narrator spoke one final time. Some people spend their lives asking where God is. Others begin to notice him in quiet acts of kindness, in faithful spouses, in strangers who stop to help, in prayers that seem delayed but are never forgotten, in strength that arrives one ordinary morning, just enough for the next step. Perhaps that is why faith is called a walk, not because every road is easy, but because every step is another chance to trust. If you are carrying a burden today, if you are waiting for an answer, if heaven seems silent, keep walking, keep loving, keep believing. Because the greatest lesson Jerome learned was not how to escape the darkness. It was how to recognize the light already walking beside him. And remember, to get out, you must go through. The end. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey. If you've stayed with Jerome from the first step into the darkness to the final glimpse of the light, thank you for allowing us to share this story with you. We hope it has encouraged you, challenged you, and reminded you that even in life's darkest moments, hope is never truly lost. If this audiobook spoke to your heart, please consider supporting Upri Studios audiobooks by giving this video a like, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications. Your support helps us continue bringing original cinematic stories and immersive audiobooks to listeners around the world. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. What part of Jerome's journey impacted you the most? What lesson will you carry with you? Your thoughts and conversations help build a community of readers and listeners who encourage one another. And this is only the beginning. Another original journey is already on the horizon. Soon we'll invite you into a new world filled with mystery, unforgettable characters, and another story that will challenge the heart, stir the imagination, and stay with you long after the final chapter. Until then, keep reading, keep listening, keep believing. And remember, sometimes the greatest victories are won not when the storm ends, but when we choose to keep walking through it. From all of us at Upri Studios Audiobooks, thank you for listening. Until our next adventure, may peace go with you.